The following broadcast is a presentation of Mount Zion Media Ministry.
International version today, beginning at Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. I'm going to read all the way through verse 23. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and make every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said unto him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den, where when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Amen. That's the reading of the word. And I solicit your prayers this morning as I preach with the help of the Holy Spirit and your help from the subject, a letter from a Babylonian jail. A letter from a Babylonian jail. I hope that most of you in this sanctuary and those of you listening to me virtually are familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. It's a letter where he takes an unusual step to respond to his critics. You see, in 1963, when he was in Birmingham, Alabama, participating in the fight for faith, freedom, justice, and equality, he was arrested along with other people. And while he was in that Birmingham jail, white ministers in the city of Birmingham wrote an open letter in the paper criticizing King and others for taking direct nonviolent action to change things. Their suggestion was that the people ought to just wait on change to come and not bring violence on themselves by engaging in nonviolent action. And they suggested that King and everybody associated with him was wrong, and even called King an outsider coming into Birmingham to cause trouble. And again, in an unusual response, King wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail to address his critics. Some believe, and I am one of them, that it is one of the best works that King ever produced. In his response, he gives the reasons why he and others, and we, must continue to be involved in the struggle for faith, freedom, justice, and equality. And he also addressed his disappointment with the American government and the white Christian community's failure to support what he believed was God's call on every Christian to fight for faith, freedom, justice, and equality. It's a brilliant work. If you've not read it, you ought to read it and find it, and you can grow from it. And so what I want to do today is not deal with Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, but I want to deal with a letter from Daniel from a Babylonian lion den. And the reason he wrote the letter to me is because I requested some help and asked him to address a concern that I have. And it's not a criticism of him. It's not a criticism of the people of his day in their struggle for faith, freedom, justice, and equality. But I needed him to help me understand something that's going on among us today. And here is my concern. The struggle still continues. But yet, too many of God's people, and I want to be clear, not all, but too many of God's people appear to be satisfied sitting on the sidelines in the recliners of apathy. They don't want to be informed, and they don't want to be involved. They just sit back, and let things happen to them that is not good for them. And one of the struggles that we face right now in the midst of us is this struggle around censorship in our schools, but also in our homes and in our churches. And hear me loud and clear, this censorship movement is not coming directly from parents who have children in the schools and they are concerned about what their children are learning. It's not coming from people in our community who are concerned about what we are reading. And it's surely not coming from people within our churches who are afraid that we are learning the wrong thing. But it's coming from a national group in cohort with other national groups who believe that it is their responsibility to maintain a certain worldview in America and the world. And they use religious language to cover up their evil deeds. They call it a biblical worldview or a Christian worldview. And brothers and sisters, if you dig deep enough, there's nothing biblical or Christian about it. If it was biblical, it would be about truth. If it was Christian, it would be about truth. Because, see, those of us who are believers, we are not afraid of the truth. Matter of fact, we want the truth because we want to be free. And Jesus said, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And so we want to know truth no matter where truth falls. But if the truth comes out, then they cannot perpetrate this false Christian or biblical worldview on us. And here's another truth you need to know. It's really deeper than censorship, but it's about control. And you can control a person or group of people when you can control their mind, when you can control their thinking. See, part of the way we think based on what comes into our mind, what comes into our eyes, what we hear, see. And if I can control what you see, and if I can control the narrative about you and the world, then I got you where I want you. And let me just say this to the young people. This censorship is not old. I'm sorry, not new. It's been around for a long time. I can just start right here in America. I can go further than that, and I will in a minute, but let me just start in America. When slaves were brought to America, there were laws enacted to make sure that control of the slave was maintained. One of those laws made it illegal for a slave to learn how to read. And the fact that somebody would teach a slave how to read was criminalized. You could go to jail. You could lose your freedom for teaching a slave how to read. Why do you think it was so important that the slaves not learn how to read? Because the people who understood how freedom comes understood that if they could become informed and educate themselves, it made them dangerous in that they no longer believed the lies. And then once slavery was over and we moved into this so-called thing called freedom and Jim Crow, then we had this issue of separate but equal schools. But even then, what we learned was controlled and censored by other folk. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it was there. And even now, in the public venue, even in our churches, we have a problem with censorship. Let me show you something. So, again, in Bible study, Dr. Glover has been doing an excellent job in bringing to us true history as it relates to Africans' participation in Christianity. And so recently he went to Egypt and he brought back for us pictures from the place of origin. Pictures not designed by other people, but images of the people who participated in those early years and brought them to us to see. And so let me just give you an example of what censorship and control looks like. So he talked to us about St. Augustine and the Confessions. St. Augustine was an African who wrote what we commonly call in the Christian faith community this book of Confessions, where he lays out Christianity, the principles, the tenets of Christianity, and every Christian denomination since then has built in part their faith on what he wrote. The picture on my right, where I'm looking of this person of color, that's who Augustine is, except when you come to America. When you come to America, Augustine's image on his book is changed. And it's not enough bleaching cream in the world to turn an African into that man. But the principle is there's a certain portion of Christianity, again, not a biblical worldview, not a Christian worldview, but a Eurocentric worldview, who wants you to believe that everything good came from a Eurocentric person group. Next slide. That picture on my right again, he shared to us this brother by the name of Antonasia, who, again, the father of Christian faith and our creed, and again, what we believe. He wrote it thousands of years, 1,000 years before it ever made its way to Europe. And so Europeans got their hands on it. And then when they brought the book that he wrote and the teachings that he wrote on the incarnation of Jesus Christ, they changed the image so that he does not appear to be the dark-skinned man with brown eyes that he is, with that African appearance, but he becomes somebody totally different. And why is that again? Because everything good and perfect came from Europe. And listen to me real good. And they understand the psychological implication. If they put a book in their children's hand of a person of color on the front and say, this is where your faith came from, they understand the psychological implication. And they don't want their children and children's children believe in that. Well, Pastor, why is it important? It's important because, once again, we're at a place where fear is driving people to hunker down on controlling the narrative. Because people, both black and white, are writing and revealing truth. And they don't want that truth out there. And I want you to know that it revolves primarily around race and the LBGT community. If I didn't get that right, y'all don't hold it against me. But information about both groups, for them, need to be controlled. And so what I want to say to you is, I am curious why we are so silent. Somebody said to me, for example, part of what's at issue is this critical race theory. Somebody said to me, somebody who's, well-educated, should be informed, told me that they hadn't gotten involved because they thought CRT stood for Criterion Reference Test, and they thought that was over. We had stopped that. It's not the Criterion Reference Test. It's about critical race theory. And so that's just one place. And there are many other struggles, but can't figure out why. Because even though you heard that announcement about the town hall meeting, and I share with you that the president of the National Educational Association, the largest labor union in the world, will be here Tuesday. The president of GAE, when attorneys from the Southern Poverty Law Center and other people concerned about education will be here to listen to this community, to hear what our concerns. You didn't plan to come. You had no intentions of coming because you don't see that as an issue. But it's an issue for you because it's going, if the laws that are being proposed go through, they're going to mess your children up for life. You're going to have children who hate themselves, and you wonder why they're killing each other and don't value black life, because when you've been taught to hate yourself, and I can teach you that, if I can control what I tell you about yourself. I stood in a predominantly white church one day, and Eric and I think Brian Abb, a couple other people were there, and I pointed to the fact that at one point Eric had been a part of the Nation of Islam, and he was, pretty deep in it, but he had gotten converted and came to a Christian. I told him that part of the reason he went to the Nation of Islam is that the Nation of Islam gave him what Western Christianity didn't, and that was dignity as a black man. Because Western Christianity tells me that my color is a curse. Western Christianity tells me that when the Bible says, and God created man, God, that was not me. And that everything about me is evil. But I'm so glad we don't believe the lie. So let me move on now. I'll spend enough time in my introduction, and so let me move quickly now. And so I sent Daniel a note. I do talk to spirits. And so he wrote me a letter, and I share with you the contents of that letter. He said this to me: "Thank you for writing me. And I am glad to respond because my people and I share a lot of things in common with you and your people in your generation." So when I was a young lad living in Israel, blessed of God, the Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, came and conquered our country. And they took the best and brightest of us and deported us to Babylon to make servants out of us. But this is what they did. In order for us to be the best servants, the best slaves, they felt like we had to be brainwashed and get everything about our heritage and past out of us. So for 3 years, we were immersed in Babylonian culture. We were immersed in Babylonian language. We were immersed in Babylonian history and social mores, and forbidden to study anything about our own history, culture, and mores. They also changed our names, took our Jewish Israelites' name and gave us Babylonian names, because they figured in addition to changing our mind and brainwashing us about culture, they also had to change what we called ourselves. Because if I can name you, I might be able to control you. And not only did they do that in terms of our culture and education, etc., but then they wanted to take our religion from us. They fed us a lie, that the religion we had was illegitimate, that we were heathens, because we served the true and a living God, and we came to Babylon with faith. And so they told us that our faith was illegitimate and introduced us into Babylonian gods and wanted us to serve them. But we didn't. Said the reason you read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the reason you read about me is because we stood up. And in spite of what we were taught, in spite of what we were told to become, to do, we decided to be true to who we were. And even though, because of the gift of God and the protection of God, we all were elevated in the Babylonian culture, in the Babylonian economy, and the political system, you see. The way I made it into the lion's den, Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered Babylon, he died and moved off the scene, and another king named Darius became king. And Darius divided the Babylonian world up. At that time, the strongest world in the nation, the strongest country in the world, into 120 provinces. And he appointed governors of every province. And I proved through my work effort and through my behavior and leadership to be better than the other 119. So he had announced that because of my exemplary work and leadership, he was going to elevate me and put me in charge of all 120. And the people who were native Babylonians couldn't understand how a slave boy, discriminated against, marginalized, not given access to who he is and his culture and his heritage, the attempt to brainwash him and make him somebody else, why he's still standing, why he's still excelling, and they were afraid of me. And as happened, Daniel, when you start moving too high, your haters will gather. And so the haters gathered and they started stalking me, trying to find something wrong in my lifestyle so that they could accuse me before the king and have me dethroned. And so they followed me and they couldn't find anything. And finally, one of them said, if we're going to find anything, it has to be in connection to his God. So they went to the king because they knew my habit of praying 3 times a day, told the king, issue a decree that anybody that bows down to pray for the next 30 days other than to you, O king, that they be thrown in the lion's den. Daniel said, I heard the decree, but I could not abide by it. But there was something in me that caused me to continue in my process. So I went up and I opened my window toward Jerusalem like I always did. And 3 times a day I bowed down and prayed. And do you know those haters, those snitches, went and told the king? And to make the long story short, so I don't keep you too long, Daniel, the king didn't want to do it, but he threw me in the fiery furnace. He tried until 6 o'clock to find a way to wiggle out. They kept reminding him, the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. If you signed it, you got to do it. Didn't want to do it, but I threw him in, and Daniel says that all night I experienced a miracle. Because the moment he threw me in the lion's den, I was expecting to see lions only. But when I got in the lion's den, I saw an angel of the Lord. And I was familiar with him because it's the same angel of the Lord that met Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. He's that fourth man that looks like the Son of God. And he looks like the Son of God because he is. He is the Son of God. He showed up and he protected me all night long. And those folk who put me in there, they ended up being thrown in the lion's den. And the same lions who didn't touch me ate them up as soon as they were thrown in there. Remind haters they got to be careful about the traps they set for others, because you might mess around and be caught up in the same lion's den that you're trying to set for somebody else. So Daniel, let me sum this up for you. I like that Daniel and Daniel talking, you know. Let me tell you, you want to know what can motivate people out of that recliner of apathy off the sidelines to get into action. Yes, sir. Let me give you 3 things to tell your people that they need to discover. Number 1, Daniel, to move folk. Yes, sir. To fight for something bigger than themselves. Yes, sir. That's not just about them. Yeah. They got to start by having a true commitment to God. Can't be a commitment to the human leader, because at some point the human leader will make them mad. Can't be a commitment along with other folk and you following because they are committed. Because sooner or later you're going to face a challenge that your commitment to your friends won't keep you there in the fight. And so your commitment has to be to God. Because Daniel, it's my commitment to God, and the rest of us, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and those of us who wouldn't bow to the image, who wouldn't eat the king's food, who refused not to pray, because we were committed to the true and the living God. And even though they taught us that foolishness, our commitment was to God, and we are glad somebody taught us about God before we were introduced to the lies. But Daniel, the commitment to God must be accompanied by a commitment to God's will. Because you really can't be faithful in executing God's will by just being committed to him, the person of God, but you also got to be committed to the will of God. And the will of God is not for some people to be mistreated and other people to be treated fair. It's not for God. The will of God is not to perpetrate lies in the church, in schools, and in our homes. But here is the will of God. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Ain't no hatred in heaven. Ain't no segregation in heaven. Ain't no foolishness in heaven.
Thanks for watching. Be blessed and continue walking in the light.